So welcome to the fifth and final webinar on the model tools. For this presentation, we're going to be going over the edible food edible food agreement. Please note the webinars are being recorded, and once them and the PowerPoints are converted to ADA compliance, we will be posting them on the website, and we will send out a listserv message once they're posted. We will also be taking questions live at the end of the presentation. So if you have a question, please put an asterisk, or you could type your question into the chat feature of the GoToWebinar. If you're not on GoToWebinar, but you're on the broadcast link and you would like to ask a question and you don't have the link, feel free to email the SLCP inbox and we'll get you that link right away. In order to be most effective, please keep all questions focused on the model tool. For other questions not related to the model tool, feel free to either contact your local assistance and market development representative or email the SLCP inbox. Before we dive into the presentation, I would like to do a big thank you to HF&H, Deborah Kaufman Consulting, and Diversion Strategies for developing all of our model tools. I would also like to thank our resource group, as well as all the CalRecycle staff who contributed to the tools. So before I begin the presentation, I just want to do a quick little intro of who will be presenting. So first we have Tracy Swanborn. Tracy is a senior manager with HF&H. She has 30 years of consulting experience assisting local governments. Her expertise is in the planning diversion programs, managing competitive procurements for collection, processing, and disposal, and developing contracts and ordinances. Tracy has been focused on 1383, actively tracking the rulemaking, presenting requirements to jurisdictions, and assisting jurisdictions with the preparation of action plans and compliant franchises. She managed the development of the 4 model tools, which include the model franchise, model ordinance, model procurement policy, and the food recovery agreement that you'll hear about. Then we have Aaron Merrill. Aaron is the co-owner of Diversion Strategies. Having roots in the industry side of solid waste and recycling, Diversion Strategies brings experience to their clients to deliver research, strategic, and executable programs and work product. Aaron is forward-thinking, well-rounded, and experienced professionally. She specializes in designing and advancing her clients' market growth needs through assessments and strategy, policy development, relationships, and project management. Prior to Diversion Strategies, Aaron oversaw development and permitting of solid waste infrastructure for Recology. Aaron has her BA in Humanities from San Francisco State University and her JD from UOP McGeorge School of Law. And last but not least is Rachel Oster. Rachel is forward-thinking, well-rounded, and an experienced professional in the solid waste and recycling industry. She specializes in designing and advancing her clients' market growth strategies through market assessment, policy development, relationship building, and project management. She began her career in the industry as a government and external affairs professional. In this capacity, she developed authentic and time-tested relationships with elected officials and bureaucrats alike at the state and local level. Ensuring a win-win result has secured Rachel's reputation as someone who communicates effectively and delivers on promises. Rachel's experience includes overseeing the profitable operation of several post-collection facilities, including composting, chip and grind, landscape supply, and landfill operations. Several collection contracts in Central California were also included in her territory. Rachel has a Bachelor's of Science in Geology from Syracuse University. And also, as you can see, you have a CalRecycle team here to also assist you and answer questions. So we have Team Edible, Kyle and Martine. We have Enforcement, Alan, and then Local Assistance, Kara. So with that said, I'll turn it over to Tracy to start the presentation.
Thank you very much, Ashley. I think everyone that's joined us today recognizes that SB 1383 is the most significant waste reduction mandate to be adopted in California in the last 30 years. The legislation has significant policy and legal implications for state and local entities, regulated generators, food recovery services, and organizations throughout the state. To assist regulated entities with implementation of SB 1383, CalRecycle, with assistance from HF&H, Diversion Strategies, and Deborah Kaplan Consulting, developed the 4 model tools that Ashley mentioned: the model franchise, the model ordinance, the model organic waste product procurement policy, and the model edible food recovery agreement. Today, we are pleased to be presenting the model food recovery agreement. This model was developed by led by HF&H consultants and Diversion Strategies. The purpose of the model food recovery agreement is to provide an example agreement for customization by commercial edible food generators and food recovery organizations and food recovery services they contract with. SB 1383 requires that Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generators, which I'll define in a few minutes, enter into a contract or written agreement with a food recovery organization or food recovery service, and this model provides an example framework to support their compliance. Before I get into the details, I need to just review some of the fine print. The model food recovery agreement is for example purposes only. It should not merely be duplicated without consideration of an individual user's particular needs or circumstances. It is not intended to cover each and every situation, nor can it anticipate specific needs. We've done our best to align the language in the model with the regulation. However, if there's any conflict, the language in the regulations or the official rulemaking record should prevail over the model tool. It's also important to note that each Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generator and food recovery organizations and services are ultimately responsible for their compliance with the regulations. And so it's advised that these parties seek legal counsel in development or modification of the food recovery agreement. I will begin by providing an overview of SB 1383, highlighting key edible food recovery dates and specific roles and requirements for each regulated entity. I'll then turn the presentation over to Erin Merrill, and she will review the objectives of the Model Food Recovery Agreement, provide an overview of the model structure and use. She will also walk through the main sections of each of the agreement, highlighting the content and customization options. And then we'll finally wrap up with plenty of time for questions and answers. The graphic on this slide highlights that multiple entities are involved in successful food recovery programs. This tool may be useful to many of those, such as the food banks and pantries, food recovery services, and of course, the commercial edible food generators themselves. We hope that jurisdictions will get the word out about the Model Food Recovery Agreement, that it's available for these parties to use and adapt to comply with the law. A little bit about SB 1383. It establishes organic waste reduction targets. It builds on the mandatory commercial recycling law, AB 1826, which jurisdictions have been implementing since 2016. SB 1383 sets a goal for Californians to reduce disposal of organic waste by 50% by 2020 and 75% by 2025 to support a reduction in short-lived climate pollutants. These disposal reductions are estimated to reduce at least 8 million metric tons of greenhouse gases annually by 2030. SB 1383 establishes an additional goal to recover 20% of currently disposed edible food for human consumption by 2025. And that's what we're here to talk about today. The regulations will take effect in 2022. Many of you have probably seen this image before. This is the food recovery hierarchy created by the EPA. It prioritizes different options for addressing the issue of wasted food, from the most preferred option at the top to the least preferred method at the bottom. Note that source reduction, reducing the amount of surplus food generated, is the top method in the hierarchy. Under SB 1383, jurisdictions are required to provide annual food recovery education to generators, and that education information is to include information on source reduction actions that commercial edible food generators can take to prevent the creation of food waste. The second preferred method in the hierarchy, feeding hungry people, is our primary focus today. This is the focus of SB 1383's 20% edible food recovery goal, and the Model Food Recovery Agreement is a tool that aims to support this process. In order to meet the 20% edible food recovery goal, SB 1383 establishes a variety of specific programmatic requirements. This slide demonstrates the timeline for some of these requirements. By January 2022, jurisdictions must establish edible food recovery programs, conduct food recovery capacity planning, provide education to generators, and begin inspection of Tier 1 commercial edible food generators and food recovery organizations and services. I want to mention that CalRecycle is developing a food recovery capacity planning tool that will be available in early 2021 that can be useful as jurisdictions tackle these types of estimates. Tier 1 commercial edible food generators must comply with edible food recovery requirements by January 1, 2022 as well. By January 1, 2024, Tier 2 commercial edible food generators must comply with the regulations. And at this time, jurisdictions are also going to need to expand their inspection program to include these Tier 2 generators. In addition, jurisdictions will need to take enforcement action against non-compliant entities, and this will include any commercial edible food generators and food recovery organizations and services that are not compliant with SB 1383 as of January 1, 2024. As you'll notice on the slide, the main difference in the edible food recovery timeline is between the Tier 1 and Tier 2 generators. And again, I'll discuss those generators in a minute. SB 1383 requires that jurisdictions strengthen their existing infrastructure for edible food recovery by implementing edible food recovery programs. This involves a number of specific requirements. And I want to note that even in communities where food recovery infrastructure already exists, there are new requirements such as record keeping, education, and inspections that will need to be implemented by those jurisdictions. So in a nutshell, the requirements include establishing an edible food recovery program, supporting expansion of food recovery capacity if needed, providing education and outreach, passing an ordinance or other enforceable mechanism to require generators and food recovery organizations and food recovery services to comply with SB 1383, and then inspecting commercial edible food generators for compliance and enforcing against non-compliant entities. And finally, a key will be reporting information to CalRecycle. So I'm going to spend the next couple slides highlighting the requirements of each of these subject areas. This slide focuses on the capacity planning. Counties, in conjunction with jurisdictions and regional agencies within the county, are required to do a couple of things. They need to estimate the amount of edible food that will be disposed by the Tier 1 and Tier 2 generators within the county. And then they need to identify existing capacity at food recovery organizations to recover that food. We'll also need to focus on identifying proposed, new, or expanded food recovery organizations and services, and identify the amount of that new or expanded capacity that's necessary to recover the estimated amount of edible food. In addition, they'll be involved in consulting with the food recovery organizations and food recovery services regarding capacity that could be accessed by the jurisdictions and its commercial edible food generators. If results of this capacity planning determines that additional food recovery capacity is needed, each jurisdiction will submit an implementation schedule to the state for how it will ensure adequate capacity, including funding for that capacity growth. Note that the model agreement does not address capacity planning, But it's important for jurisdictions to be aware of this and understand it's a requirement that they need to comply with. In terms of education and outreach efforts, SB 1383 defines some responsibilities for jurisdictions related to food recovery. Jurisdictions must develop a list of food recovery organizations and services that operate in their jurisdictions that the generators can utilize, and this list is required to be published on the jurisdiction's website and updated annually. CalRecycle is looking for the list to include organizations and services that are playing a meaningful role in food recovery and have a program that is proven and a track record for recovering food safely. Jurisdictions are also responsible for providing annual education information to commercial edible food generators. Jurisdictions must provide information on the jurisdiction's food recovery program, the generator's requirements to recover edible food under the state regulations and the jurisdiction's program. They need to identify the food recovery organizations and services operating within the jurisdictions. They need to identify actions that commercial edible food generators can take to prevent the creation of food waste. There are other educational requirements that include providing education materials in languages spoken by a substantial population group in the city, maintaining copies of materials provided, distributing materials at the proper frequency and format as specified in the regs. Jurisdictions do have the option of providing this education material through print or electronic media and may additionally conduct direct outreach through workshops, meetings, or site visits. This information may be provided by including it with regularly scheduled notices, such as inserts in mailed invoices, or it could be rolled into other brochures or information provided to businesses. Note that the education and outreach requirements are not covered in the model agreement because the agreement's between the generator and the organization. But again, we want to make sure jurisdictions are aware of their obligations under the regulations. Jurisdictions are also required to maintain records and report to CalRecycle on the food recovery programs. This slide shows the various program areas for which jurisdictions are responsible for reporting. Jurisdictions are required to maintain certain records, including a list of the commercial edible food generators in the jurisdictions that have a contract or written agreement with food recovery organizations or services. And again, this model provides an example of that type of agreement. They need to maintain their list of food recovery and organizations and services, as I've mentioned, and their edible food recovery capacity. They need to include documentation of the action that the jurisdiction has taken to increase edible food recovery capacity. Edible food recovery reporting requirements for jurisdictions includes the following that they need to submit to the state. The number of commercial edible food generators, that's tier 1 and tier 2, located within the jurisdiction. The number of food recovery services and organizations operating that have agreements. The total pounds of edible food recovery capacity planning activities they've conducted. And for education requirements, jurisdictions must report the number of edible food generators that receive the information and the type of education and outreach provided. In addition, jurisdictions need to report on the inspections that they've conducted, including inspections of commercial edible food generators and food recovery organizations and services. The Model Edible Food Recovery Agreement addresses record keeping and reporting that occurs between the generators and the food recovery organizations and services. And note that the model ordinance, which we talked about yesterday, includes requirements for the commercial edible food generators to maintain records and for food recovery organizations and services to maintain records and report annually to the jurisdiction. So it is important that that record keeping recording gets built into your ordinance as well. SB 1383, as I mentioned, breaks commercial edible food generators into tier 1 and tier 2 categories, or I should say it defines tier 1 and tier 2. It is possible there are other commercial edible food generators that don't fit within these categories, and those businesses are not required to comply. So the tier 1 generators include your typical larger volume generators, such as supermarkets, grocery stores, food service providers, food distributors, and wholesale food vendors. Many of these entities already have food donation practices in place and others don't. So we need to get at all of these tier 1 generators, and they need to comply with the food recovery requirements by January 1 of 2022. The tier 2 generators include businesses, many of which may have more prepared food available for food recovery. These are your larger restaurants, hotels with on-site food facilities, health facilities, as well with on-site food facilities, large events and venues, state agencies with cafeterias, and local education agencies, schools with on-site food facilities. And the deadline for their compliance is January 1, 2024. The model agreement includes definitions for each of these generator types that aligns with the SB 1383 definitions. Commercial edible food generators are required to arrange for recovery of the maximum amount of edible food that would otherwise be disposed. The regulations indicate that they must do this through a contract or written agreement, and they can comply with this requirement in one of two ways or a combination of both. The edible food generator can contract with food recovery organizations or services that will collect their edible food for recovery, or they can contract with a food recovery organization and self-haul their recovered food to that food recovery organization. But they do need an agreement in all cases. This requirement to have a contract or written agreement is the reason the Model Food Recovery Agreement was created. The model serves as a template and starting point for creating such contracts between the generators and the food recovery organization. So it will support the tier 1 and tier 2 generators with compliance with SB 1383. We believe the model will also set food recovery organizations and services up for success in the process of providing their services, because it outlines very specific requirements and sets everybody up to understand the food recovery donation objectives and standards. Commercial edible food generators are also required to maintain records related to their edible food recovery activities. Specifically, the record keeping includes maintaining a list of each food recovery service or organization that collects or receives the edible food from the business, a copy of the contracts or written agreements between the commercial edible food generator and the food recovery service or organization, and a record for each food recovery or organization or service that the generator has a contract with that covers the following: the name and contact information for that organization, the types of food collected or self-hauled, the frequency for food collection and self-hauling, and the quantity of food collected or self-hauled, and that's measured in pounds per month. The agreement helps comply with all of these. Jurisdictions will want to include these record-keeping requirements in their ordinances for the Tier 1 and Tier 2 generators, and the example language is covered in the model ordinance. Food recovery organizations and services that contract with or have written agreements with commercial edible food generators pursuant to SB 1383 are required by SB 1383 regulations to maintain records related to edible food recovery activities with the commercial edible food generators that they work with. Many of these record-keeping requirements are already being tracked by well-established food recovery organizations, and other organizations will need to come up to speed. Specifically, food recovery services must maintain records of the following: the name and contact information for each edible food generator that it services, and then the quantity of edible food collected and transported in pounds per month, and the name and contact information for each food recovery organization that the food recovery service transports the food to. Food recovery organizations must maintain records of the edible food generators, the names and contact information of the edible food generators it receives food from, the pounds again per month, and any food recovery organizations that deliver the edible food to them. I should say food recovery services that deliver the edible food to the food recovery organizations. In the regulations, food recovery organizations and services have one reporting obligation, and that is to annually report to the jurisdiction that their primary address is physically located in, the total pounds of food recovered from Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generators in the previous calendar year. This requirement applies only to food recovery organizations and services that have contracts or written agreements with Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generators pursuant to SB 1383. Again, I want to mention that jurisdictions will want to include this reporting requirement in their ordinance, and the model ordinance has some example language for that. Finally, jurisdictions are responsible for edible food recovery capacity planning, as I previously mentioned. And the capacity planning includes a requirement to consult with food recovery organizations and services. And the food recovery organizations and services that are contacted by jurisdictions to provide capacity planning information must respond to the jurisdiction within 30 days regarding their available or potential or new or expanded capacity. And that's written right into the regulations. And again, you'll want to include, jurisdictions will want to include that in their ordinance, and the model language is available for that. That wraps up my overview of SB 1383 edible food recovery requirements. I'll now turn the presentation over to Erin Merrill to cover the model itself.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Tracy. So getting into the model itself, this is designed again for the edible food generators and the food recovery organizations and services. So the question, how do we make all these requirements a reality? The Model Food Recovery Agreement really aims to support the steps in the process. The key objectives of the model are listed on this slide. First, the main objective of this model agreement is to really provide commercial edible food generators with a tool to support their compliance with SB 1383, which requires them to enter into a contract or written agreement with a food recovery organization or service. The model also addresses key contract issues to guide safe food handling, to prohibit commercial businesses from donation dumping, and present a range of structures for commercial business compensation arrangements to the food recovery organizations and service providers. Finally, another key objective of the model is support jurisdictions with development of their edible food recovery programs. So let's start with how the Model Food Recovery Agreement was developed and what you can expect when using it. First, we started by researching and compiling examples of existing food recovery resources used by organizations around the state. This gave us a better understanding of various approaches and where customization of the model may be needed. We then built out the structure of the agreement itself, including identifying areas where options are needed. Ultimately, the agreement is organized using a main body agreement, as well as attachments for further details, which we'll discuss later in this presentation. The Model Food Recovery Agreement is designed to be flexible and adaptable for use by different food recovery organizations, food recovery services, and commercial edible food generators across the state. We recognize there's a wide variety of options and approaches around the state, and we have attempted as best we could to reflect those in the model. As we noted at the beginning of the presentation, this model tool does not constitute legal advice. Parties entering into a food recovery agreement are encouraged to seek legal counsel appropriate to their particular circumstances regarding compliance with the regulatory requirements. So as mentioned, guidance notes are integrated into the Model Food Recovery Agreement to explain how specific sections and provisions of the model can be adapted to your needs. General guidance notes are highlighted green and are included to help users understand how to make those decisions. Blue shading identifies situations where you are expected to fill in the blanks or edit language to meet your specific needs. Language that is specific to SB 1383 is shown in blue font, mostly in the definition section, and language not directly from SB 1383 but relevant for a food recovery agreement is shown in the black font. So provisions within the model are intended to apply to a variety of program and arrangement types for food recovery operations. Now, we know that each one has a unique relationship and unique organizational and regional circumstances that will impact how they use the agreement. In response, we've included a variety of options and pathways throughout the model. This allows users to choose their own adventure and create a document that will be most effective for their program and unique conditions. Different conditions will necessitate different options to be chosen. These examples include determining whether edible food will be collected or delivered. A service may come and pick up, or the generator may be expected to self-haul. This includes identifying which party is responsible for which task. Second, identifying the business model and whether a fee will be charged for the service or whether the service is donation-based or has no fee. Again, keeping in mind there is not a one-size-fits-all approach. We recognize that the different organizations, services, and generators will have different ideas about how the model works, and we need to have the customization available to accommodate this. The Model Food Recovery Agreement addresses a variety of commonly used or potential programs and service options. However, we couldn't possibly get into the details of modeling each and every specific business model. Therefore, sections will need to be modified, added, or removed to meet your specific needs. So our hope was to make the body of the agreement have generic terms used for most situations, and the attachments could be used to be more flexible. You can also insert all the details into the body of the agreement itself, but it would make the agreement less flexible over time, and we'll discuss this more later on. The model is intended to allow you to make your agreement as simple or as complex as you'd like. Your agreement may be longer or shorter than the model, depending on your preferences. Such optionality is indicated and discussed in the guidance notes. For purposes of simplifying the amount of repeated information in the model tool, many sections of the model use the attachment approach rather than in the body. But again, this is entirely up to the parties in the agreement. So let's take a look at the model structure. This outline shows the contents for each section of the agreement. We will review all of them. We have not listed all the attachments on this slide, but there are 5 of them, and we will go over them. Note that 3 of the attachments, A through C, are only to be used if details within those exhibits are not embedded in the body of the agreement. So jumping in, Section 1. So Section 1.1 details the specific food types accepted and or preferred by the food recovery organization or service. Some examples of details include the food type. This could be listed by types of non-perishable, perishable, and prepared foods. It could be specific examples of food, as well as packaging and label requirements. Examples of preferred goods may be items that are in high demand amongst the population that the food recovery organization serves, such as items of high nutritional value. Section 1.2 in the model details the opposite. This is where the user of the tool would specify items not acceptable for donation or collection. This could be for a variety of reasons that are specific to the organization, such as food type, food quality, nutritional value, and more. So jumping into Section 1.3, this section reinforces the food recovery organization or the service's right to refuse donations. Some examples that a donation might be rejected include food safety, improper storage, the items not agreed upon for donation or on the unacceptable foods list, a lack of transportation or storage space, and the items currently needed are not currently needed by the recipient. Now again, note that SB 1383 prohibits commercial edible food generators from intentionally spoiling food that is capable of being recovered by a food recovery organization or a service. Now, this section may also be used to outline any notification specifications that the parties to the agreements wish to include for these situations. These specifications might include a requirement to notify the donating party that the donation has been rejected. It may include the reason for rejected and an outline of how the rejected food shall be handled. Parties should include documentation of the refusal process. This documentation is not a requirement under 1383, but may be included if both parties wish to have more detailed records or work towards a continuous improvement strategy for more recovery. Parties to the agreement may also want to include a provision on employing best practices to minimize any ongoing donation rejections. This could include best practices such as inspecting the donation before leaving the commercial edible food generator site, prompt notification and communication between the parties, and other practices that would help minimize rejected donations and the cost and liability incurred as a result of such rejections. So Section 2 goes into food safety requirement and protocols. Now, while it's not specifically detailed in SB 1383, food safety is of paramount importance for food recovery and is a critical consideration for all the parties involved. This section requires food recovery organizations and services and generators to be in compliance with all federal, state, and local regulations regarding food safety. Some details mentioned include permits and recall processes. Now, this section in the model agreement intentionally avoids being overly prescriptive. It does not detail the federal, state, and local food safety regulations. We opted to take this approach because SB 1383 requirements do not supersede local, federal, and state regs or DEH directives. And also, it was out of concern for providing information that might inadvertently conflict with other regulations. Instead, the model food safety provision directs users of the model to insert the level of food safety information desired and to lean on expert food safety resources to do so. Links to food safety resources and guidelines are embedded in the guidance notes in the beginning of the model. Now, again, a key note is that this model is customizable and parties may integrate specific food safety requirements at their option. So Section 3 of the model focuses on transportation of edible food, how this transportation will happen, and establishes a party responsible for transportation and collection. The party or parties responsible for the transportation of food may include a food recovery organization, a generator, a third party, or a hybrid option. The section also details specific instructions for transportation. For example, details for this section may include pickup and delivery addresses, the acceptable days and time windows for pickups or deliveries, and other special instructions such as how the donations are compiled, designated check-in and communication protocols, inspections, and more. For purposes of streamlining the agreement and ease of amending the document, some of the detail on transportation, collection, and staging has been incorporated as an attachment. The section also establishes protocols in the event of missed or delayed pickups or deliveries. Some of the issues covered includes who retains possession of the food in the event of a delay. The model agreement provides example language that allows a commercial edible food generator to retain possession if a delay cannot be accommodated. For example, if the delay results in a delivery after hours. It also includes notification processes in the event of changes that are also contemplated throughout the section. Example of changes include donations not being available on the scheduled day, holidays, or other closures that might affect transportation. Parties may choose to include charges for missed or delayed pickups, or may even include a provision for termination of the agreement for consistent instances of missed or delayed pickups. So SB 1383 specifically prohibits the practice of donation dumping and delivering a donation to a food recovery organization without its consent. Donation dumping is the act of donating food to a food recovery organization that does not accept that type of food, or the donated food is not recoverable for human consumption. This section clearly outlines that this practice is prohibited and that the generators will not knowingly donate unusable or unsuitable food, force donation after capacity, or deliver outside of agreed upon time windows. The agreement includes some examples of penalty options that can be used in the event of donation dumping. For instance, commercial edible food generator must compensate the food recovery organization for any cost incurred as a result of donation dumping. Notification that this action may result in immediate termination of the agreement, and notification that the commercial edible food generator may be reported to the local jurisdiction. So Section 4 is in regards to equipment protocols. This section is to be used for scenarios in which either party is using equipment provided by the other party. This could include food containers, coolers, or thermal blankets. The section should specify the type of equipment, the protocol for maintenance and return of the equipment, and the sanitation of the equipment, if applicable. Language can be amended to accommodate the specific equipment, use protocols, and return protocols. The list of specific equipment borrowed by either or both parties can be included as an attachment, and that could be updated on a periodic basis. So Section 5 deals with documentation and reporting. This section outlines the documentation needs between the parties. This can be documentation required internally, such as for tax purposes and or for regulatory reporting. And as mentioned in our 1383 overview, both commercial edible food generators as well as food recovery organizations and services have record-keeping requirements. This section of the agreement outlines who will be responsible for record-keeping and reporting and who needs to provide what to who. Now, options are presented in this section for commercial edible food generators providing documentation to the food recovery organization or service, or vice versa. Depending on the logistical arrangements between the parties, it may be appropriate to delegate the responsibility of certain documentation actions to one party. Examples of documented information may include donation types and description, donation time, donation weight, and signature or other confirmation by each party at the time of pickup and/or delivery. Finally, if desired, the parties may specify the format and submittal requirements of the required information. For format requirements, the parties can determine paper or electronic submittals. They can also establish time periods for which the records are to be retained. So Section 6 provides language that includes different fee structures that are dependent on the financial model of the food recovery organization or service. Since fee structures can vary greatly, the language should be amended and tailored to the user's specific financial model. Users can select from a range of generator payment options included in the model. Example language is provided for fee-for-service models. These options include variations such as fees paid by the generator per pickup, fees paid per pound of food collected, flat rate payment by the generator per month or at another frequency, or a hybrid of these options or a tiered payment structure. In addition, options are provided in which fees are not collected. These options include generator provision of financial donations to the organization, or a generator provision of in lieu or in-kind payments. For example, generators may donate vehicles, refrigeration equipment, or storage space, or engage in some other cost-sharing type model. The model agreement also provides options that contemplate payment being provided externally, such as through another funding mechanism, such as third-party funding, tip fees, franchise fees, or other mechanisms. Section 7 is terms and conditions. This section enumerates various terms and conditions for the execution of the agreement. These terms and conditions determined the amendment and approval processes, the effective date, term, and termination options. Other conditions documented in this section include requirements for the parties to provide a contact for the administration of the agreement and insert non-performance criteria. This section also provides additional liability language that you would want to have reviewed by your legal counsel. So now we're going to talk about the attachments to the agreement. As noted, attachments A through C are only to be used if details within those attachments are not embedded directly in sections 1, 3, and 4 of the agreement. For that reason, we're going to spend a little more time reviewing attachment D, the definitions, and attachment E, context for agreement. Okay, so attachment D is the defined terms. Some of the defined terms were obtained directly from SB 1383 definitions. Others are from example food recovery programs. The nuances of defined terms and their relationship to one another can have a significant impact on the meaning of the provisions of the food recovery agreement. For this reason, parties to the agreement are advised to carefully review the definitions of the model agreement and SB 1383, as well as any definitions contained in existing agreements if applicable. Users should modify existing definitions and/or integrate the new ones where needed. Now, it is likely that some of the definitions in the model can be used without modification, while others may need to be tailored to the party's unique conditions, program, and contractual arrangements. However, make sure you are still compliant with SB 1383 when you do these modifications. Now, note that not all of the terms in the definitions section have been used within the model agreement. Additional definitions have been provided as a reference for other definitions that may be included in a food recovery agreement. And finally, users of the model agreement should add or delete definitions as applicable based on the terms selected for their specific agreement. So attachment E allows the user of the model to assign contacts. Including this as an attachment is beneficial because if a contact changes, only the attachment will need to be updated rather than the entire agreement itself. In this section, it is best to list the person who will interact most with donations or collections, the day-to-day contact. However, additional contacts such as legal representatives or management may also be listed in addition to the day-to-day contact. So that wraps up the content for each of the sections of the model agreement. The Model Food Recovery Agreement provides example language. Again, given the diversity of approaches to edible food recovery, the model language will need to be customized. We recognize it will not be a perfect fit for each situation, but we hope that it will provide a solid foundation for each agreement that will need to be entered into. Now, depending on the preferences of the contracting parties, users of the model may choose to include more comprehensive or detailed provisions within the framework that we've provided, or users may choose to simplify the model provisions. Here are a few more tips and tricks for customizing and finalizing the document. First, modify the language. Adjust the model language to fit the user-specific needs. For example, customize the list of foods accepted and prohibits and select the feed payment arrangements. Customize the level of detail included, and the actual agreement may be shorter than the model or longer depending on the preference of the parties involved. Second, delete the guidance notes and the unused options. Highlighted guidance notes are presented in the model for reference only and are to be removed by the user when preparing its final food recovery agreement. In cases where the model offers multiple options, optional provisions that are not selected are to be deleted and the section numbers must be modified accordingly. Next, blend the existing provisions with the model provisions. Users that have existing food recovery agreements may want to select provisions from both the model agreement and their existing agreement to blend together to create an agreement that best suits their needs. On style and design, we have used multiple colors and highlighting to differentiate content to make it easier for the users. We've also used styles that meet the accessibility guidelines for CalRecycle. You do not have to do that in the use of your own agreement, and your agreement may and should adapt to your style. Now again, seek legal counsel. While the regulations specify that commercial edible food generators must enter into an agreement, the regulations do not specify the content of the food recovery agreements, so commercial businesses and the food recovery organizations and service providers have latitude on the content. It is advisable to seek legal counsel in development or modification of its agreements to capture provisions deemed essential by the parties. Finally, case studies. CalRecycle, in conjunction with HF&H Consultants, has developed a series of case studies that spotlight how jurisdictions and entities are implementing some aspect of SB 1383. We have created 2 case studies for each of the model tools. With respect to the edible food recovery portion, we are showcasing Fresno Metro Ministries Edible Food Recovery Program and France's Edible Food Law. You can read these case studies by following the links provided on this slide. So finally, thank you very much for listening. You'll find the Model Food Recovery Agreement, as well as the other 3 model tools, the ordinance, the Model Franchise Agreement, and the Model Procurement Policy at the links shown on this slide. Now I'll turn it over to Kyle. We'll use the remaining time to respond to questions and receive any comments.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I'm Kyle Pogue, Environmental Program Manager with CalRecycle, and big thank you to everybody involved in helping create this tool. A real big shout out to HF&H and Diversion Strategies both. But I also want to mention that was thrilled to get the resource group members included in this as well. And just to remind folks, this resource group included members from public health departments, California Association of Food Banks, restaurants and grocers associations, food recovery organizations and services, and others as well. So I think it was critical not only to the rulemaking and the language we've built into the 1383 regulations, but also in tool development to have a diversity of input on these things. So I really want to thank all of you for that. I also want to go on to mention that and I see there are a lot of questions coming in right now, and we are doing our best to answer those questions as we go. But if you do have questions, put an asterisk in that questions field in the GoToWebinar feature. I see some of you are doing that. For those questions that we have been unable to answer thus far, we'll direct you to unmute your phone and you could answer that. If you're unable to unmute, we'll have someone read that question for you. I do recognize that many of these questions are unrelated specifically to the tool that we are presenting here today. Most of the questions appear to be related to the 1383 regulations themselves, and I just want you all to know that we are working on, for our web resources and ultimately future outreach as well, a series of frequently asked questions that should answer many of these that have been asked in here. This will help us also build and add to that list as we see the questions that you have. And just letting you know that there will be plenty of other opportunities to learn more about the content of these regulations and what's included. So we're going to try and focus on tool development here today and what this tool looks like, but realizing there are some crossover in questions that apply to the regulations. So at this point, I think I'll turn it over to the Q&A team to open it up. Thanks.
All right, so our first question is from Susan. Susan, you can go ahead and unmute yourself and please state your full name and affiliation. Okay, I will ask Susan's question. So she has two. The first question, does a food business like Blue Apron fall under Tier 1? And the second question, how is CalRecycle suggesting jurisdictions deal with Tier 1 businesses' desire to keep donation amounts private as well as the agreements?
Okay, I'm happy to open this up to anybody on the team that wants to field that question. In terms of Blue Apron, we'd have to look closely at the definition and see how that business specifically applies in this circumstance. Martine, I don't know if you have further clarification on that.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you, Susan, for your question. I noticed a lot of the questions that came in were very regulation specific. So as much as possible, I really would like for us to have questions. The first questions be asked that are specific to the Model Food Recovery Agreement before we dive into the regulations. But Susan, to answer your question, really any entity that meets one of SB 1383's commercial edible food generator definitions and the associated threshold will be required to comply with the commercial edible food generator requirements.
Okay, thank you, Martine. I'm sorry, one more time. Could you do the second question again? Okay, I think there was a question about data, proprietary nature of data, right? As it comes in, and I'll just say that the data that we are asking for, and we've heard that comment many times throughout our rulemaking process, is that data is aggregated and not specific to any specific donor. So we're looking at this reporting happening on a higher level in aggregated amounts.
If I can just add to that, Carl, the food recovery organizations do need to identify the businesses that they have contracts with, so you'll know who they've received material from, but you're talking about aggregating the total quantities and reporting that out annually to the jurisdiction.
Correct. Thank you, Tracy. Okay, next question.
Neil, Neil Shapiro, did you want to ask your question specifically?
Yeah, hi. You can hear me, right?
Yes, we can hear you.
So I think you answered, but one of them. So just to clarify, the threshold is whether you fall into a category 1 or 2. It has nothing to do with the amount of food waste you produce, correct?
Correct. It's based on the definition of both Tier 1 and Tier 2 edible food generators and whether they fit within that definition.
Okay, and then for Tier 2, the first one, restaurants, it has or. So is it one or the other, or if you have 200 seating and you're more than 5,000 square feet, would you have to do it?
Martine, would you like to take that one?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Neil. It's an or. So if you meet either one of those, you would be in. You don't have to meet both. I mean, I do just want to expand a little bit on what Kyle said earlier about the minimum amount of food. Each generator type that you see listed as Tier 1 or Tier 2, those were carefully picked out based on a number of different things. The amount of potentially donatable food that they're disposing of that could be recovered for human consumption before it's disposed. We also looked closely at the generators in California that have robust food donation programs, so that a lot of these generators, especially those in Tier 1, are already participating in some kind of food recovery activity. So this is not going to be brand new for them. Beyond that, we consulted a lot throughout the last 4 years since we began rulemaking with food recovery organizations and services throughout California, which included the California Association of Food Bank, consulting with them to make sure that the generators we were including, that we were on the right track, that they were seeing opportunity there. And then we also verified that with our data on generator-based food waste.
Okay, so our next question is from Jennifer Gilbert. Jennifer, you can unmute yourself to ask your question and please state your affiliation.
Thank you. I'm Jennifer Gilbert with the City of Davis. So I really appreciate this tool. This is going to make things a lot easier. Thank you. I'm wondering if there's going to be a similar tool, or maybe there's a way that we can tweak this tool for cities to use to have agreements with the food service organizations and providers to make sure that, we're responsible for making sure they have capacity. Is there going to be a tool developed that will help us and create some sort of an agreement or contract or process to do exactly that? Because we're going to need to have something to ensure, see what your capacity is, how much do you need. As you guys said, a lot of these are already working with their Tier 1, so clearly they have the capacity already. So I'm just curious if anything is going to be provided to us like that.
Tracy, do you have something to add to that one, please?
Certainly the model franchise doesn't cover that. And I think the reality is that the food recovery organizations and service providers is a very local kind of situation, so that there may be a lot of capacity in some areas, there may be less capacity in others. And then, agencies like counties or other food recovery organizations are supporting those organizations in different ways. So I don't know that there's a one size fits all kind of solution to that. That's from my perspective. I don't know if anybody else has anything to add to that.
Yeah, if I understood your question, Jennifer, you're referencing a model that would be between the jurisdiction itself and either a generator or a organization?
Just between us and the organization, who would be collecting the food. To figure out what is their capacity, how, okay, so they say we need this much capacity. Okay, so, but they're already collecting from all of the Tier 1s already. So how do you actually need more capacity? Is there any framework that we can use? Maybe it's even just models from other cities and that would assist. We're just trying to wrap our heads around this.
Kara, aren't you working on a capacity planning tool that includes the food recovery piece?
Yeah, and I can add to this, you guys. And Tracy, I'm sorry to drop that one directly on you there. And Martine can certainly add to this too. We are, as a team, working internally on an edible food recovery capacity planning tool that will help jurisdictions do this very thing. And also, Martine and I working on a survey as well that could be modeled and used by local governments to reach out to determine what that capacity looks like currently. And Martine, you can add to that too, please.
Yeah, so thank you so much for the question. It's very important, capacity planning. And so, we didn't envision it as being a contract, but rather we are in the process of developing tools to assist with compliance, specifically with the edible food recovery capacity planning requirements. So a couple of things that we've been working on, as Kyle mentioned, is the first is an edible food recovery capacity planning calculator tool. It would allow jurisdictions and counties to calculate the amount of edible food. So this is food that could be recovered for human consumption, the amount of edible food that is currently disposed by commercial edible food generators located within the county and jurisdictions within the county. So that's the first tool. We're currently in the development of that. We will be using our waste characterization data as the input data for that tool. The companion piece to that is what Kyle mentioned, that survey. So once a jurisdiction or a county identifies the amount of edible food that's going to be disposed of that could be recovered for human consumption, that survey could then be administered to local food recovery organizations such as food banks, food pantries, food recovery services, and other nonprofits to identify what is your current capacity, how many donors are you working with, how many new donors are you able to work with, startup costs, ongoing costs, and many other things to really identify, do they have capacity, how much capacity do they have, and if they're willing to expand, what would they need most to make those expansions, things like that. And also on top of that, something that's critical for food recovery is, do you have the capacity to recover different types of food? So if you're in the prepared food space, then that's fantastic, because there's going to be, as of 2024, a lot of prepared foods needing to be recovered. Many food recovery organizations and services actually aren't equipped to handle that type of food. So that's an important thing to be aware of. So I hope that answered the question, but the answer is we are working on resources and tools to assist with compliance.
And I'd just like to add one more thing. Tracy, sorry, the reason we dropped it to you to start is to talk about Section 10 in the model ordinance and the requirements that jurisdictions would place on food recovery organizations. Could you just talk on that briefly?
Yeah, in the intro slides, I talked about requirements both for edible food generators and food recovery organizations to maintain records and report. And the model ordinance, not the model food recovery agreement that we talked about today, is the place for jurisdictions to include those requirements to establish that reporting. Also, in the section of the model ordinance on the food recovery organizations, we include a piece that they're required to provide capacity planning information upon request and include that 60-day sort of turnaround or response period so that you have that in your ordinance and can hold them accountable to that.
Okay, thank you very much. That's really helpful. Thanks a lot.
You're welcome. Who's next? I am seeing some questions related to the tool specifically in here.
Next question is from Kanya. If you can unmute yourself and share your affiliation and question. I have to find it. Okay, I'll read the question. When we visit our local stores, the management there have no idea what we're talking about and provides no information about their corporate contacts. Can we get a list of the right people for these common tier 1 generators?
Thank you, Marshall. One response I did offer in there that's related to this is that we have been working with specific associations throughout California, California Grocers Association, California Restaurant Association, and others to get the word out about that. But we recognize there are a lot of participants in this, so there will be a need to expand. our reach and how that applies to specific contacts. So I'll just mention that is on our list to continue to work to get that word out specifically to the people who need to receive it through our outreach and education efforts. Anybody please add to that? Okay, hopefully I've answered your question there. Maybe take the next one.
Our next question is from Nazreen. If you'll unmute your phone and state your affiliation, you can ask your question. All right, I will read the question. If an edible food generator has a contract with a recovery organization outside of the jurisdiction, how can the jurisdiction enforce reporting and record keeping?
Okay. Anybody on the phone want to take a shot at that? Maybe Martine, are you interested?
Yeah, sure.
Thanks.
Thank you, Nazreen, for the question. So the requirement for commercial edible food generators is that they have a contract or written agreement with a food recovery organization or service for food recovery. They do not have to have a contract or written agreement with an organization or service that's located in the jurisdiction. This is critical because a lot of these organizations in many cases are spanning counties and in some cases regions. So we needed there to be flexibility there to make sure that this food's getting recovered. The commercial edible food generator is required to maintain records. They are not required to report. So they're maintaining a record of a copy of their contract or written agreement, the names of the organizations and services that they're contracting with for food recovery, the types of food that will be recovered, the established frequency that the food will be recovered, and the pounds of food recovered per month. So this is really just making sure that this is record keeping. The jurisdiction where the commercial edible food generator is located is able to, as part of monitoring compliance, we'll go to that generator and say, I'd like to see your records to verify that they are in compliance with these requirements. That is verifying, that's the monitoring of compliance right there. They're verifying record keeping and ensuring that that contract really does exist. The reporting is on the food recovery organization and services side. So food recovery organizations and services are required to maintain records of the food that they receive from the generators that they work with. However, for reporting, they are only required to report the total pounds collected in the previous calendar year to the jurisdiction, one jurisdiction where their primary address is physically located. So there really shouldn't be convolution there. That's how that works in the regulation. So it can get complex. Both Kyle and I are available. If anyone on this webinar has more specific questions that are directly related to the edible food recovery regulations, please reach out to us. But I do just want to make sure that any questions that are specific to this tool are answered on the webinar today while we still have time.
Thank you, Martine. And you guys can see why I have her answer some of these questions. She's so good at it. And I will just say that, many of us, all of us included, are going to need to hear these, answers to these questions and read closely the regulatory language and look at the resources that we're developing to make sure that we're consistently and fully understanding what's in them. So just want to say there will be more and more opportunities for that as we go forward. And anyway, Martine, thank you for that. Seem to be getting a little feedback right now, but maybe we can move on to the next question.
Next question is from Allison Schill. Allison, did you want to unmute yourself and ask it?
Sure. Forgive me if there's a gardener in the background. I was wondering, it seems like with this need to have a contract with every single nonprofit organization that a food generator is getting a rescue from, that we're going to leave out a lot of the smaller or perhaps more one-time food pickups or donations to like smaller churches, and it's really going to give preference to larger food banks and larger food recovery organizations, which will kind of monopolize in a large way the way that food recovery efforts happen in California. I'm wondering if there's any way to go about having generators have not contracts, but still doing food pickups as long as they're recording all the information.
Thank you for the question, Allison. It's a good one. And there's no intent through what we're working on to try and squeeze out or exclude, I should say, small or a diversity of food recovery organizations or services from participating in this. I think what we need is a diversity of those, recognizing that many organizations are equipped to, or only equipped to accept certain types of foods in certain types of ways. So I think we really need to recognize that. And I think these agreements, although this looks extensive, what you have in front of us, I think once you distill it down, it can be relatively short and easy to accomplish. So I think there are more ways to go about that, and happy to discuss that more and also offer if anybody else wants to add to that. Thanks.
Hi, Allison. This is Martine. Thanks so much for bringing this up. The only thing I would add is that Kyle and I do plan very soon on reaching out to several different grocers, specifically addressing this comment. For example, there are some grocers, and many of them actually have a contract with Feeding America. And there are certain stipulations in that contract where, a certain percentage of baked goods can be included in the recovery. So, they don't want to be overloaded with food that maybe doesn't have a lot of nutritional content, or, they just don't have a need for. So having said that, there are smaller organizations that do want that food. And it's not just baked goods, it can be other types of food. So we want to work with them and see what can be done. I mean, the most important thing to remember is SB 1383 is really trying to get food that would otherwise be sent to a landfill recovered. So if that food would otherwise go to another small food recovery organization that maybe it's a type of food that they don't have it very often, or it's baked goods and there's a smaller nonprofit that's willing to take it, that's not food that would otherwise go to a landfill. So we do want to make sure that this is meaningful and the maximum amount of edible food is being recovered. And with that said, the contracts and written agreements are critical. They are critical to make sure that we are having the maximum amount of edible food be recovered, but also that there's an added layer of professionalism, reliability, and food safety and protections in food recovery throughout California. Protections for food recovery organizations and services, from donation dumping, from unwanted deliveries, from making sure they're getting food that's still fit for human consumption, all of that, but also making sure that the generator knows what's expected of them and that they're working with the most appropriate organization for them. It might even be more critical now, arguably, with COVID-19. There are certain things in the Model Food Recovery Agreement that I think will be particularly helpful, specifically around, delivery drop-off times and windows, the protocol for when the food is recovered, things like that. But ultimately, the main point I want to make is that we want this to be meaningful. We want to divert edible food from landfills and make sure that it's going to its highest and best use of helping feed people in need.
All right, our next question is from Marissa Gann with the City of Livermore. Her question is it possible to have one agreement for all franchised locations within one jurisdiction or region? For example, do all 3 Chipotles in my town need a separate agreement if they have the same contract terms?
That's a good question, and take a shot at it. I don't see why they couldn't. It seems the consistency amongst those franchisees would make a lot of sense to have, so why not have one consistent contract for it. So I would say yes. Others amend as needed here.
Kyle, I think the only thing I would add to that makes sense to me is that each Chipotle would need to have that agreement on site in the event that they are inspected. What do you think about that?
I think that's a good thought, Kara. Anybody else want to add?
Yeah, exactly what Kara said, that, these sites will be inspected. And so they need to have those records on site, and the records need to be site specific. So when it comes to total pounds recovered per month by the food recovery organization that they work with, it shouldn't be all those 3 Chipotle's numbers. It should be for that one Chipotle.
Yeah, and I'll just add to my earlier thinking, it depends on where these Chipotles are located too, right? And what organizations and services are available there. So it may not translate directly that, and I'm sure it wouldn't, statewide that you have one organization that you're going to work directly with, right? There's a diversity of those. So I think that to the degree that it's perhaps that franchise working with one organization or multiple organizations under one agreement, that's fine. But I think they're going to have to be customized to account for that difference in service. Thanks.
All right, our next question is from Lisa. Lisa, if you can unmute yourself and ask your question, and please state your affiliation. Lisa McCullough. Okay, I will ask Lisa's question. From a business standpoint, in an ideal situation, a food generator will become more efficient in their operation and find ways to decrease their food waste over the years. In time, as this occurs and a jurisdiction's total food recovery tonnage numbers drop, how is this addressed in reporting, and how does CalRecycle view the effectiveness of the food recovery program if it's stats driven?
Okay, good question there. I'll just start by saying, that's a benefit we want to see actually through 1383 implementation. We want to see edible food generators become more efficient, right, and not producing as much excess edible food. So we hope that this also leads to that additional benefit as well. I think it's a good question, Martine. Would you like to kind of take it from here?
Yeah, I love hearing that question because that is definitely, as Kyle said, something that we want to see. It's also part of the reason why we require in the regulations commercial edible food generators to maintain records of the food that they had recovered from their site. As many of us know, what gets measured gets managed. So we added that in for a couple of different reasons. One was, of course, for enforcement purposes to verify a generator's compliance. But the other reason was to build in some mechanism where the generator would be able to see, okay, I've donated this much of this type of food in the past month. Maybe we need to adjust our ordering, or maybe we shouldn't be producing as much. We have seen data throughout California where when generators are tracking their food waste or their donations over time, it does have a force reduction effect in many cases. So that's something we absolutely want to see. And remember that, these agreements, although a frequency for the collection of this food has to be established, there's nothing that prohibits a generator in a food recovery organization from, say, establishing more than one frequency or changing the established frequency as is needed. So a good example of this is schools, a K through 12 school during the school year pre-COVID when schools were in session and, some of them are starting to open again. They have a lot more surplus edible food available for donation when school is in session, but during the summer months, that could change significantly. So the established frequency maybe doesn't make sense to be as often as it was during the school year. These are all things that the regulations really are silent on. We just state that an established frequency must be specified. So it's between the generator and the food recovery organization or service to determine what works best for them.
Thank you, Martine. I know we've got about 10 minutes left. I want to take 1 minute for myself here just to mention something, and then we'll move on to some additional questions that we have. I just wanted to build on a point that Martine made earlier about, about this agreement. And I see the purpose of this, and this is kind of an open palette for you guys to use to create your own agreement. But what it really does is it formalizes and kind of empowers that relationship in between the organization and service and the generator, to make it as clear as possible on how we best work together. And I just think it's an opportunity there to further and formalize something that already exists in many respects out there, but maybe not quite to this level. So I encourage you to use this tool in the way that works for you best to help with those relationships. Okay, maybe we can move on to the next question.
Yeah, and Kyle, just to build off of that, I think since we have so many local jurisdictions on today, this is the agreement between the generator and the food recovery organization or service. And so we often get asked the question, so what's my role as a jurisdiction with this model agreement, right? We get that question a lot. And, I think first and foremost, we're looking towards the jurisdictions through their education and outreach to these Tier 1 and Tier 2 commercial edible food generators is to let them know that they are going to need to have an agreement. So when they are looking to have their edible food recovered, that should be one of the questions that they're asking that food recovery organization or service. Hey, I'm supposed to have an agreement that I can keep on file. So part of this is asking for your help and educating those generators on what their requirements are. And certainly as you're interacting with your food recovery organizations and services and getting to know them, same thing. If many of them already have established agreements, and the model was built off of many of those existing agreements. So it's probably more your role is educating generators on their responsibility to have that agreement. So I hope that's helpful. And Erin, I saw you nodding. You've heard that question a lot, I think, from jurisdictions. Do you have anything else you wanted to add on that?
You're on mute, Erin.
Thanks. You would think with all the Zooms nowadays, I'd be on top of that mute button. No, I think you covered it well, Kara. I think all these questions go to support, I think, the challenge we had, which was reflecting how many of these different scenarios are out there. And all that went to making this a very, as flexible as we can imagine, customizable tool.
Okay, thank you. We've got about 7 minutes left. So what do we have?
All right, our next question is from Mandy Brooks, and you're unmuted. So if you unmute your phone, and please share your affiliation and your question.
Yes, this is Mandy Brooks with Salinas Valley Recycles. I asked a couple questions and now I don't remember which one it is. I apologize. I think it was regarding local food bank, and I think the main one was, is there anything in this model tool that talks about if our local food bank is not willing to share their data or resources, what enforcement actions would be taken, would CalRecycle take, and or what enforcement actions would the local jurisdiction be required to take? Not that we're hoping it gets to that, but yeah, our food bank was surprised at all of this, even though we've been talking with them for probably about 2.5 years. So any feedback on that would be super helpful. And I appreciate all the work that's being done. Thanks.
I guess this is Tracy. I'll start. I'll circle back to the model ordinance again. The model ordinance is the place, or your ordinance is the place where you'll want to embed the requirements for the food recovery organizations and services to maintain those records, and then to do the annual reporting that Martine described out to the jurisdiction. Under the regulations, you're required to take enforcement action commencing January 1 of 2024, which would include a notice of violation and ultimately penalties. Prior to that, if you identified food recovery organizations or service providers that weren't complying with those requirements, you'd provide them education. But again, that responsibility for that enforcement falls on your back through notice violations and penalties ultimately.
And thank you so much, Tracy. This is Martine. I do also want to add to that, for good reason, and I hope that there are some food banks on the call. So if there is a food bank on the call and you have something to add, please add. Their food banks can be protective of that information, and for good reason. There is significant competition over this food. It does take, in some cases, months, if not years, to develop a relationship with a food donor and build that relationship. And because there's competition for that food, there are times where a donor, in so many words, could be poached. We've even heard cases where someone shows up for the food saying that they're from that food recovery organization and they're not. So for good reason, as I mentioned, food banks can, and other food recovery organizations are protective over that information that they have deemed proprietary, which is the name of the donor and the time, place that food is going to be recovered, in addition to the data on the pounds recovered. CalRecycle, what I want to make clear is that CalRecycle does not require any proprietary donor information to be reported. CalRecycle only requires the food recovery organization or service report the total pounds collected in the previous calendar year to one jurisdiction, and it's the total pounds collected from the commercial edible food generators that they contract with or have a written agreement with pursuant to 1383. With that said, food recovery organizations and services are required to maintain records. And so jurisdictions, as part of their inspections, can request to see those records. And a failure to make those records available could be seen as, I'm sorry, I'm getting some feedback. If others can mute their microphone, that would be helpful. Thank you.
I think we got it.
Thank you. So as part of inspections, the jurisdiction can request to see those records, and a failure to make those records available could be seen as a failure to comply with record keeping. But I do, again, just want to make it clear that food recovery organizations are protective of this information. And so jurisdictions and food recovery organizations are partners in this, and you want to foster good relationships, trust. So, really requesting to see the records that are actually required, not we're asking to see records that maybe do not pertain to SB 1383. That's just very important. And also, I highly recommend speaking to your local food bank and asking them about their concerns. At CalRecycle, we've been doing that for the past 4 years. We really worked hard to try to make sure record keeping requirements are consistent with information that these organizations already track. We didn't require them to report information that would be deemed proprietary or make them uncomfortable or could put their organization at risk of losing donors. So I hope that that's helpful. But you can always reach out to Kyle and to me if you have any additional questions.
Thank you, Martine. Thank you, Tracy. Appreciate those answers. Maybe we have time for one more question before we wrap up.
All right, so our last question is from Annika. Annika, you can go ahead and unmute yourself to ask your question, and please state your affiliation and full name.
Hi, everyone. This is Annika from the City of Oceanside, Annika Anderson. I'm asking about, of the tools that you've already provided, are you going to be providing any additional tools when it comes to developing infrastructure for value-added processing facilities, as much of the edible food that you may be receiving from large generators will actually need to be processed in some way before it can reach people to be fed? For example, we've seen, liquid eggs as something that could be donated, but you can't necessarily get that in a food box. So I just wanted to see what kind of work CalRecycle is doing to kind of help support jurisdictions when they're trying to create these facilities.
Thank you for the question, Annika, and others can help me with this. I do want to recognize that when it comes to infrastructure development, that we currently have a food waste prevention rescue grant program cycle that's open. That closes November 20th. You could consider perhaps something in that vein if you take a look at the criteria and how that fits. And I know Oceanside has been successful in the past in that grant program, so thanks for your efforts there. Someone want to add anything to what I just said? Thanks.
Yeah, I'd like to add, Kyle. I think, the type of businesses that you're talking about are considered recycling manufacturers. And so CalRecycle has worked with a number of companies that are in this space. Misadventure Vodka, they take bread kinds of products and use that to make vodkas, one example. We have a number of other examples. So CalRecycle, through some of our, as Kyle mentioned, some of our grant programs and our low interest loan program, as well as a number of state incentive programs, we align those with various businesses who are interested in either expanding or starting up a new project like that. So I think the degree to which we can continue to promote those types of companies, and I'll make note of that for our 1383 web team, where we'll continue to build our website, to build highlighting examples of companies that are entering into that space. And I think we already have some on our website, but we'll make sure that we do something to make that a little bit more prominent. So thank you so much for that suggestion. And if you have any other suggestions related to expanding those types of companies and projects, please let us know.
Thank you for that ad, Karen. I just want to be clear on the Food Waste Prevention and Rescue Grant for this cycle. Upcycling activities are not eligible for this particular activity. It's rescue, prevention and rescue focus. So just want to reiterate that. So I think we're past our time at this point. Couple of kind of closing thoughts. I really want to thank Julia, Russ, Marshall, our Q&A team. That also includes Martine, superstar. Thank you, Martine, and the IT team for helping us pull this off. So thank you to everybody that's included in this and for the tool development and your work on this. So a lot of expertise, much appreciated. If you have questions, which gauging my read of the questions here, you're going to have more. You can send those to the SLCP inbox, and that really is slcp.organics@calrecycle.ca.gov. So if you have lingering remaining questions, you can send them there. But also realize that there is going to be future ample opportunities to learn more about the specifics of the regs. I do encourage you to read them closely. I know reg reading is not everybody's favorite, but they're all there for your digestion. So please go and do that. And I think with that, we'll close it out with a hearty thank you for all of you who participated today. So have a good rest of your Wednesday.
Great.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.